Thank you for coming. As you can see, I'm not Professor Finkel, who was unable to be here. So he asked me to present the talk tonight and the speaker tonight. It's quite extraordinary. He grew up not far from where I did. He's currently teaching at the University of Durham, which is where I went to university. We've discovered we've got an awful lot in common. Anyway, our speaker tonight is Rob Geist Pinfold. He's from the University of Durham in the north of England, but he also works at the Peace Research Centre of Charles University, Centre of Israel Studies in Prague. And that's another connection because I also do things with Prague University too. So Rob is a lecturer in international peace and security at Durham University's School of Government and International Affairs. Alongside his role at Durham, as I said, he's a research fellow in Prague. He's a scholar of international security whose research intersects the study of strategy and territorial conflicts. His work has been published in a number of academic journals, including some very prestigious ones, such as the Journal of Strategic Studies, and his book manuscript, Understanding Territorial Withdrawal, Israel's Occupations and Exits, has just been published by Oxford University Press. So without further ado, Rob, the floor is yours.
Set myself up a timer. Right, there we go. Yes. Good evening, everyone. Thank you very much, Mark, for that wonderful introduction. And thank you very much, everyone, for joining us today. And thank you for giving me the opportunity to escape the harsh climate of a Durham spring for slightly warmer weather. So much obliged on that front. As mentioned, my name is Rob, and I'm a lecturer in peace and security at Durham University. And what I'm going to present tonight for you is my book, Understanding Territorial Withdrawal, Israeli Occupations and Exits. Now, I've given this talk many, many times over the years because this book, it began like as a PhD thesis way back in 2014, but I've had to make a couple of changes given the contemporary reality on the ground in Israel and indeed in the Palestinian territories. Now, what my book looks at is this research question of what makes states or occupiers in particular, what makes them withdraw from occupied territory, or on the other hand, entrench themselves within it, with a focus on Israel, but not exclusively limited to Israel. Now, the first change that I've made is basically to remove a lot of the theoretical or methodological justification, talking about generalizability and a universe of cases, the sort of stuff you normally hear in academic book talk, simply because given events on the ground, what people mainly want to talk about is this book and its applicability to the contemporary conflict in the region. So I wanted to give us more time to focus on that and basically garnering conclusions from the book as to how to understand why Israel is doing what it's doing and how it might operate in the future in this ongoing conflict. And the second thing is that when I initially started presenting this as a PhD thesis, a lot of people said to me, even before I started, they said, Israel, Palestine, not an interesting conflict. It's a frozen conflict. People aren't, focused on it for the time being, focus on more contemporary conflicts. And if you're looking at occupations and exit, which is, within the research area of territorial conflict, again, territory isn't that interesting. States don't really fight over territory that much. And obviously, unfortunately, I've got rid of all of those arguments justifying why focus on Israel, why focus on territorial conflict, for the worst kind of reasons, right? We have Russia's occupation and an annexation of large parts of Ukraine. And of course, you have the ongoing conflict in Israel and Gaza. So those are some of the changes that I've made. I hope that I can use the book as a way to jumpstart discussion on the current situation. I'm happy to take questions or comments in the hope that we can have a lively discussion and, dare I say it, debate on what's going on at the moment and why Israel is acting the way it does and how things are likely to change in future. But before I get on to that, more bigger picture stuff. What do I mean by occupations and exits? Well, I actually want to focus, this as defining occupations and exits. I want to focus just for the time being on defining occupations. What do we mean by occupation? This is a word that's thrown around all the time, like terrorism. It's kind of a word used to apply to people doing things you don't like. But actually, there is a legal understanding of the term occupation. When we say occupation in international law, what we're talking about is when a state controls a foreign territory over which it does not claim permanent sovereignty. So what, in layman's terms, what we're talking about here are instances where one state goes into the territory of another state and basically usurps responsibility there, is the de facto controlling state there. It runs what's happening because it's ejected the sovereign, but it hasn't annexed the territory. It hasn't applied its laws or sovereignty. It hasn't said this territory is ours forever. So the idea is that occupation is a temporary thing, okay? It's supposed to end. And there are two classical routes for an occupation to end. One is the quote unquote bad way, where an occupier annexes that territory. They say, actually, this isn't temporary anymore. We are staying. You know, this is ours. As we saw very recently in Ukraine, for example, with Russia annexing occupied territory. That's the bad way. International law doesn't see that as something that should be allowed to continue, and that's backed up by international norms as well. The quote-unquote good route is for an occupier to withdraw from a territory. Now, international law recognizes that there are going to be occupations, but they should be short, and the occupier shouldn't change the status quo on the ground. They should eventually withdraw. So that's the quote-unquote good way for occupations to end. Now, interestingly, despite the fact that, as I just said, occupations and exits and territorial conflicts are and remain prevalent in contemporary politics, as a good PhD student, I tried to look at the relevant literature to see what's been written about these topics. And actually, there are very, very few works on occupation and even fewer on exit. The ones that do engage with occupation are, I would argue, conflate and dilute the understanding of occupation, engage in something that I call concept stretching, applying the term occupation to things that actually weren't occupations. One book that I read was about Britain's occupation of Ireland. And actually, Britain didn't occupy Ireland. Britain annexed the entire island of Ireland and considered it part of Great Britain until the early 20th century. So it's a different form of territorial behavior. And the second book that I read was talking about the quote unquote Roman occupation of Gaul, which I think is significant stretching of our understanding of occupation. Even more interestingly, I guess I could say, that book ended with policy recommendations based on the Roman occupation of Gaul that could be applied to the US occupation of Iraq and Afghanistan. So I didn't want to do that. I wanted to focus on contemporary or more contemporary manifestations of territorial conflicts and occupations and exits in particular. Now, exactly, asterisks and obelisks. So having said that, there are enduring occupation exit dilemmas that manifest across a variety of cases in very, very different time periods. And these are exemplified by a couple of quotes that I chose. The first of these is, you have brought an army into this country, but how do you propose to take it out? And actually that was said by an Afghan chieftain during the first British invasion of Afghanistan to a British diplomat. And this, I think, exemplifies the problem of occupiers where, yes, going into a territory is considered controversial, it's a risky decision, but that pales in significance when you consider all of the issues of leaving. More often than not, occupiers think and plan conquering a territory, but they don't consider when or how to leave. And as a result, they kind of sink into that territory, even if they don't really think they want to be there. And again, that's exemplified by a quote. This is from a George Orwell book, Burma Nights, where he recalls a conversation between himself and another British officer. And this officer in Burma says to George Orwell, "We've no right in this blasted country at all. Only now we're here, for God's sake, let's stay here." And this captures what I call in my book the occupation trap, where an occupier realizes that an occupation is not doing them any good anymore, if it ever did. It's soaking up significant blood and treasure, generating international pressure, domestic dissensus. But there's kind of this path dependency of, well, we're here now, so we kind of have to stay because, you know, who knows what might happen otherwise, or we've spent so much time and money here, we have to stay. And that manifests throughout all of Israel's case studies of occupations that I analysed. And then the third commonality is the occupier's hubris. And you really see this in this cartoon here. You might not be able to see it far at the back. This is a cartoon in a US newspaper from the US occupation of Haiti, which is one of the cases, the non-Israeli cases I look at in my book in the early 20th century. And what you see here is this kind of gigantic US Marine holding up Haitians, basically just teaching them civilization. The caption of the cartoon is "The Missionary." And this captures the hubris that accompanies occupiers on so many different occupations worldwide. This idea that we can just go in, throw our weight around, do what we want, and basically preach civilization and then leave when we want. And that is so very rarely the case. Now, on to my research question. So I mentioned it previously, but it's always good to reiterate. Why do some occupations end, whereas others persist? And a related question, what factors influence an occupier to withdraw from an occupied territory, or on the other hand, to entrench themselves within it? Now, as I say, there's not many works on this, but a lot of the existing international relations, international security literature tends to be from the 90s, which means it's part of this kind of paradigm war between realists on the one hand and constructivists on the other. Do you think a state's territorial policies are determined by the international system or by internal factors within that occupier, within the state you're looking at, to do with values and culture and history? Now, I was less interested in taking a side, and I was more interested in how different levels of analysis interact to basically, as I say, induce withdrawal or ensure that an occupier entrenches itself. So you have those two obvious ones, kind of what's happening inside the occupier, what's happening outside the occupier. But I'm also someone with a PhD in war studies, and the first thing they teach us is that the enemy always has a vote, right? It's not just external in terms of what happens between the occupier and third parties. It's what happens between occupier and occupied that also is very important in determining whether an occupation continues or ends. So I use three different levels of analysis. I call them arenas of bargaining, just because there's so many different things going on inside of them. So I have the international arena of bargaining, so interactions between the occupier and third parties, the domestic arena of bargaining, what's happening inside an occupier, and then last but not least, as I say, this bilateral arena of bargaining, bargaining between the occupier and occupied, sometimes violent, sometimes non-violent. And I argue it's these three arenas you have to look at and the processes that manifest there, how they interact with each other, that determines whether an occupation ends or not. Now, pushing on to the case studies, again, this is where I go into a lot more detail at a standard academic book talk. Basically, the long and short of it is, aside from the normative reasons or the contemporary geopolitical significance, there's a lot of reason to focus on Israel when you're looking at occupations and exits, simply because Israel has occupied territory from every single one of its neighbors since 1945. That is unheard of, basically, for pretty much any other state that I know in international politics. And what's even more interesting is you can compare across cases. Some of these occupations ended in withdrawal, some of them didn't. There are notable ones that didn't, most notable being Israel's continued occupation of the West Bank. There's also Israel's occupation and indeed annexation of the Golan Heights, territory it took from Syria. So you have continued occupation, the West Bank, you have annexation, the Golan Heights, and you have territorial withdrawal, Israel's withdrawal, for example, from the Sinai Peninsula, Israel's withdrawal from southern Lebanon, and Israel's withdrawal from the Gaza Strip in 2005, though we may obviously be watching history either unfolding or repeating itself. And then I threw in another couple of cases that were not Israel related, just to kind of test for generalizations across cases, see if what I identified, the commonalities manifesting in each Israeli withdrawal also manifested elsewhere. And those case studies were the US occupation and exit from the island of Hispaniola in the early 20th century, which was actually an occupation of two different countries, Haiti and the Dominican Republic. And again, I'm happy to talk later about why I included those case studies, but I found that at the end of the day, given events, what people want to talk about is how all of this is relevant for Israel, and how all of this basically feeds into Israel's territorial policies, what Israel's doing today, how is that reflected by some of the case studies we looked at, or I look at in my book. So to cut a long story short, the key issue here is to look at the role territory plays in Israel's grand strategy. And when I say grand strategy, I think of Barry Posen's famous definition of that contested term, a state's theory for creating security for itself, though obviously we're at SAI, so we can use also scholars like Hal Brands, who argues in a more broad terms that grand strategy is how a state uses the resources at its disposal to get to where it wants to go. And territory is one of those key resources for Israel for two reasons. One, because it doesn't have very much of it. And two, on the other hand, it thinks that territory is a way for it to achieve security, for a way for it to survive. Now, Israeli grand strategy is actually quite pessimistic. Israel doesn't really want to thrive, it wants to survive. And it sees territory as key to its survival. And as a result, its grand strategy in the early days of the state is actually a revisionist one. Israeli governments, various Israeli governments, made up of parties across the political spectrum, reject Israel's borders. When I say Israel's borders, I mean Israel's recognized borders. The borders the international community sees are Israel's legitimate borders, the pre-1967 borders. Looking at this map here, it's the kind of blue, the dark blue bits. That's what the international community sees as Israel. Many Israelis across the political spectrum saw those borders as a recipe for disaster. Abba Eban, Israel's foreign minister from the early days of the state, famously a dove on the left of Israel's political spectrum, he even referred to those borders as Auschwitz borders, i.e. an existential threat, not something that's good for Israel, something that Israel should reject and try and expand its territorial control. And then as a result, consequently, you see the Six-Day War of 1967, where Israel's territorial control expands fourfold. And this is where everything changes, because it achieves something that Israeli governments have always been searching for, something called strategic depth. Strategic depth is this idea that Israel doesn't have enough territory, so it needs to capture more territory beyond its recognized borders in order to push fighting away. It's based on this pessimistic notion that there's always going to be war, there's always going to be conflict with your neighbors. So if there's going to be armed conflict, it's better that it's further away from your urban areas, from your urban heartland. For example, here, the space between the West Bank and the Israeli city of Netanya on the Mediterranean is actually only around 12 kilometers. Okay, so again, it's this feeling that we don't have much territory. We need to push the fighting away from our very sensitive urban areas, from this underbelly here. So Israel achieves strategic depth, and as a result, it basically shifts to become a status quo power. It's no longer a revisionist state. It seeks to hold a lot of this territory. It gives some of this territory back, for example, the Sinai Peninsula, and indeed it withdraws from the Gaza Strip. So I look to basically see, were those anomalies, those instances where Israel leaves territory, is that kind of a new grand strategy away from prioritizing territory, or is it part of the same continuum? And that's something I'm going to discuss a little bit as we go on. But what I think this quest for territory creates is something that I call the territorial security dilemma. Now, in IR theory, international security theory, the security dilemma is normally when two states get engaged, who don't want to be, get engaged in an arms race with each other and eventually end up going to war, even if that's not what they want. In Israel's case, it's slightly different, but it's still a self-fulfilling prophecy. Basically, Israel thinks it doesn't have a lot of territory, and if it takes more territory, it will become safer. But it's the act of taking and occupying that territory that often makes Israel feel less safe. Why? Because it creates friction between occupier and occupied, because it creates international pressure and tension between Israel and third parties, including but not exclusively the United States. And those two pressures within those two arenas of bargaining lead to domestic crisis within Israel as well, more often than not, where basically there's a whole debate within Israel about whether this occupation is good for Israel's security or not. So it's kind of this self-fulfilling prophecy of wanting territory to feel safe, but actually it's that craving for territory and that acquisition of territory that can often make Israel less safe. So what are my generalizable findings? What manifested in each case of territorial withdrawal? Well, first of all, every withdrawal is a gradual process. It's a long and complex process of policy reassessment. Now that may sound obvious, but what I'm trying to say here is that withdrawal is often very well, in no case study here do you see Israeli leaders trying to preempt something bad. Most of the time they withdraw from territory when things are already bad. when there's this feeling that actually this territorial security dilemma manifests. The territory is rife with violent attacks by rivals. There is international pressure against Israel and real threat of sanctions, for example. And there is a domestic dissensus within Israel. Israel's domestic arena is divided about what to do with the territory. But this policy reassessment is often after a very, very long and painful process of escalating enemy violence and escalating international pressure. So enemy violence was always critical here. Unprecedented enemy violence preceded each and every single withdrawal from Israel's withdrawals. Now, this is the controversial point that often gets me in a lot of trouble. People say to me, so, you know, you're saying that violence against Israel works, that the Israelis only understand force. And I'm not saying that. A lot of the time, you know, that is a necessary, but it's not a sufficient condition. You know, on several occasions, there were instances where Palestinian groups, for example, thought all we need to do is use force to eject Israel from the West Bank, for instance, at the time period being the Second Intifada from 2000 to 2005. And Israel, and actually it's that escalation of violence that means Israel responds with violence of its own and manages to actually kind of win a counterinsurgency campaign. So it's not a sufficient condition on its own. You need all of these other points to manifest as well. Though it is important to note that violence is critical, not because Israelis only understand force, but because it's violence that makes you question the utility of the status quo. If an occupation is supposed to make you feel safe, if enemy violence is actually escalating and attacks are escalating, it shows that occupation is not neutralizing the threat. It may even be feeding it. Just one quick case study example, Israel occupied southern Lebanon in the early 1980s. The idea there was to clear out Palestinian groups who were using the territory to launch rockets into Israel. Israel managed to do that, but at the same time, it created what Israelis would consider a monster. It created the Hezbollah movement. It created such resentment amongst the Shiite population of southern Lebanon that it led to the foundation of Hezbollah, which was actually a far more dangerous and strategic level threat to Israel than these Palestinian groups ever were. So it just shows you that violence is a critical factor here in every territorial withdrawal. The third factor is international bargaining. So it wasn't just a case of, again, it wasn't just a case of you can only use force works. You also need to have pressure from the international community. Now this can be mediation, and more often than not, it was mediation, like from the United States primarily, but it can also be fears of the international community putting a peace plan on the table, for example, that Israeli governments considered were strategic threats to them, and in some cases, inducements as well. So I'll give you an example, and I'm happy to talk about it a little bit more later. Israel left the Sinai in 1982 and got a peace treaty with Egypt. The funny thing is the Israelis weren't that interested in a peace treaty with Egypt. They took it, they were happy with it. But the main reason they left the Sinai is because the US got involved as a mediator and basically bribed both sides, said to both sides, look, you know, you're fighting over this territory. You both think this territory is valuable. How about we change the equation and promise you an alliance with a global hegemon if you give up these small territories in the Sinai Desert, for example. So that's one of the beginnings of the US-Israel special relationship, and that $3 billion in aid the US gives to Israel, that actually begins in Israel's willingness to leave parts of the Sinai, for example. Fourth, this domestic consensus is critical. Now, I include this here because a lot of the time when I'm speaking to Israeli audiences, there's this perception in Israel that some of these withdrawals were kind of forced on an unwitting or unwilling public by the deep state, by kind of elites within Israel who have this sort of radical agenda that doesn't match the populace. That was never the case. There's always a consensus supporting each and every exit. That is another necessary condition. Fifth, no withdrawal was ever truly unilateral. I'll talk about that in a little bit. Don't want to waste too much time here. But basically, there's a couple of withdrawals here. Israel's exit from Lebanon and Israel's exit from Gaza in 2005 that Israelis see as unilateral, i.e. we left territory without getting or expecting anything in return. As my research shows, in neither case was that true. And the sixth one, which is something that I found really interesting, was each time an occupier withdrew, it entrenched itself elsewhere. So we often, this really challenged me, because you often think of territorial withdrawal as conflict resolution, as a way to getting us somewhere better, somewhere different. And again, I was looking at whether these withdrawals were Israel changing its grand strategy. Actually, it wasn't. It was a continuation of that same grand strategy of preferencing territory and territorial control. But basically, it was a realization that we have to give up some territory. Let's throw a bone. Let's give them a territory we don't care that much about. And then when we leave that territory, kind of practice a territorial give and take, use the lessening of international, domestic, and bilateral pressure to entrench ourselves in a territory that we really do care about, normally, but not exclusively, the West Bank. So just rushing forward, because I see, time is ticking away. Thank you very much. It's good feedback. So just an example here, you probably can't see this on the left because my PowerPoint skills are quite poor, but this shows US aid to Israel. And many people don't know that, the US didn't and Israel didn't start out as kind of natural allies and bedfellows. Israel only started getting billions of dollars in US aid, as I said, after it chose to withdraw from parts of the Sinai. This was a gradual process. Israel gradually gave up bits of the Sinai, and the more bits of the Sinai it got, the more money it got from the US. So before the first Israeli withdrawal from the Sinai, the US was giving Israel $0.5 billion a year, an escalation from previous years, but nothing compared to today. It was then you see a huge escalation. The first time Israel leaves a part of the Sinai, it gets $2.5 billion a year from the US. In 1982, when Israel leaves the entire Sinai, it gets nearly $5 billion in compensation from the US. So I'm just using this to show, first of all, how international factors and international bargaining is critical, but also how this US-Israel special relationship, there's another side to it here beyond the Israel lobby, for example, the Walter Mearsheimer book. There's also territory and the role that territory played, and the US's role as a mediator in convincing Israel to give up territory in exchange for an alliance with the global hegemon. Now, the slide on the top right is the West Bank. No prizes there because we all probably know where it is. But the one thing I wanted to stress here is that we often think of the West Bank as one sort of solid territorial unit, looking at the conflict from outside. Most Israelis, even if they won't tell you this is not how they see the West Bank. Israelis value different parts of the West Bank differently. There are many parts of the West Bank that Israel has been willing to withdraw from. There are many parts of it is completely unwilling to withdraw from. This is the difference between the West Bank and the other case studies. So it's not that Israel has never been willing to withdraw from the West Bank, it's been unwilling to withdraw from the entire West Bank. Israelis often particularly value parts of the territory with the most sentimental, historical, cultural value to them, and the most security value to them. What that normally means is the border areas of the West Bank. There's mountains, for example, along the borders. It basically is right next to Jerusalem, is very close to Tel Aviv, for example. So those are parts of the territory that Israelis have never been willing to withdraw from. And often in the past, Israeli governments have, this is what's often annoyed both the US and the Palestinians in negotiations, when Israel has said, yeah, we will retrench our presence in these parts of the West Bank, and at the same time, we'll build more settlements in these parts of the West Bank. Because to Israelis, this is not contrary. But to the Israel's international bargaining partners, this is kind of Israel showing malpractice in negotiations and not negotiating out of good faith. So to move on very quickly, because I want to end up talking about Gaza. I think Israel's withdrawal from Gaza in 2005 really exemplifies a lot of those points that I mentioned. So the kind of traditional narrative here that you'll hear in Israel from both supporters and opponents are, we were in Gaza, we left Gaza unilaterally. We didn't do it with a deal with the Palestinians. We left it because we basically gave the Palestinians a gift to turn the Gaza Strip into the Singapore of the Middle East. They didn't. Hamas took power. We got rockets fired against us, the October 7th attacks, all a result of Israel's leaving Gaza. And I tried to question this narrative from various angles. First of all, Israel did not actually leave all of Gaza in 2005. Israel left 19% of Gaza in 2005. Israel had left 81% of the Gaza Strip in the early 90s, again, because Israel values the territory differently. It kept the areas where the settlements were and the military bases were, those red points on the map. It left the Palestinian populated areas of the territory because, as in the West Bank, Israel likes to have overall security control of territories. It does not like to be involved in the day-to-day, everyday governance in the Palestinian territories, things like education, healthcare, policing. Israel likes to be as disengaged from those as it possibly can. So that's what we saw there in 2005, Israel leaving that 19% of the Gaza Strip that it still controlled. This was not a unilateral withdrawal. It was not negotiated with the Palestinians, but it was negotiated with the Americans. Okay, the Americans, this was the Bush administration at the time. They sat down with the Israelis, and they, as a result of Israel leaving Gaza, the US pledged that Israel would not have to withdraw to the 67 borders in the West Bank, i.e. basically allowed Israel to leave Gaza, to entrench itself in parts of the West Bank, and that no Palestinian refugees would be resettled in Israel as part of a peace deal. So Israel got political concessions for this withdrawal. It just didn't get them from the Palestinians. And the critical thing here, the really interesting thing that almost very few people know about, is that Israel was actually willing to leave not just the Gaza Strip in 2005, but also 70% of the West Bank. So the Israelis and the Americans sat down and they negotiated exactly where Israel would withdraw from, not just what concessions they get, but where Israel would withdraw from. The Israelis came to the Americans with several possibilities. They all involved leaving Gaza, this 19% of Gaza, but one of the possibilities was leaving 4 settlements in the West Bank, a token West Bank withdrawal. The other was leaving around 20% of the West Bank, and the other was leaving around 70% of the West Bank. The Americans said, no, 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 you only leave those 4 settlements, that's it. And why did they do that? Was this sort of a nefarious neocon plan to make Israel solidify its control over the West Bank? No, it was because the Americans saw the withdrawal for what it was. Israel's attempt to leave all these territories to entrench itself in the 30% of the West Bank it really cares about, and it doesn't want to leave under any circumstances. It was giving up more territory because it didn't value that territory to entrench itself elsewhere. And the Americans then vetoed that option because they saw that Israel was trying to set its borders without negotiating with the Palestinians. The Americans wanted Israel to negotiate a 2-state solution with the Palestinians using this Gaza withdrawal as a springboard. The Israelis wanted to use the Gaza withdrawal to stop them negotiating a 2-state solution with the Palestinians. So, you know, that's just kind of some of the examples here of some of the narratives that I wanted to unpack in Israel's history of occupations and exits. Now, just as my voice is going, I will end very quickly on the final slide. So, what's happening today in Gaza, and how does my research relate to that? Well, I'd argue that what we're seeing here is old wine in a new bottle. We are not seeing Israel annexing the entire Gaza Strip. We're not seeing anything like that. What I think we're seeing is Israel exporting its West Bank model to the Gaza Strip, i.e. basically having overall security control of the territory whilst having as little to do as possible with the humanitarian and everyday governance needs of the Palestinian population of the Strip. So Israel's occupation has changed lately in terms of its distribution. You're seeing soldiers falling out and pulling back from most of the Gaza Strip. Instead, you're seeing the establishment of a security zone, like sort of solid corridor, that red there on the map, which Israel is not just occupying, but actually instigating like a checkpoint regime there of all sorts of high-tech scanners to identify suspects or people they want to arrest, for example. Israel has talked about basically, and it's re-established a territorial buffer zone of 1 kilometer around the Gaza Strip. So again, it's that strategic depth, re-manifesting this idea that we need territory beyond our borders to be safe. And there are other similarities here. First of all, it's a lack of a plan for the day after. This is the crystallizing plan for the day after that we're seeing today. But we do not have Israel's government speaking with one voice, as with many other occupations that we see here. This is not a kind of Machiavellian genius or even a unitary actor. Different people in Israel's government want to do different things with Gaza. Some people want to annex the territory. Some people want to resettle the territory. Some people want to leave the territory. And we're talking just about government ministers here. And as a result, what you often see in Israel's history is Israel continuing to occupy territory, not because it thinks the occupation is good for Israel, it just sees it as the least bad option, the thing that's going to blow up in its face less and create less of a cabinet or domestic crisis. So it sort of perpetuates this ambiguous status quo. And I'd argue that's what we're seeing today. Occupation of the Gaza Strip as a least bad option, the resurrection of territory as a way to achieve security, and having as little to do with Palestinian affairs as you possibly can. Now, the question is, what happens here? Just to end on this note, so back in 1985, Israel formed an occupation of southern Lebanon. It had already been in the rest of Lebanon, so the occupation of southern Lebanon was actually retrenching its occupation elsewhere. It was trying to basically have a more sustainable long-term occupation. But Shimon Peres, Israel's defense minister at the time, said this would be the IDF's, the Israel Defense Forces, last winter in southern Lebanon. Bit like saying the war will be over by Christmas, okay? Because it was not for another 15 years that Israel left Lebanon, because it had no plan for what to do with the territory. It had no plan for the day after, and there was no consensus on what Israel was doing there or should be doing there. And unfortunately, to end on a pessimistic note, I think we're seeing exactly the same variables and processes play out today in the Gaza Strip. Thank you very much.
Well, I'm going to throw the floor open straight away. I would merely ask you to identify yourselves, and let's go. Gentleman over here.
Hi, my name is Georgi Kent. I'm a first-year Master's in International Relations student. And I guess my question is, do members of the Israeli government, just looking at the history and the way that the different occupations have gone, do they really assess this as being a successful strategy for their own security in the long run? And is there any chance of shifting of perspectives or this model of security that they pursue? Thank you.
I'm going to take two at a time. Somebody else. Please, with the glasses here at the front. Please say who you are and...
Thank you for your presentation. I'm Nassim Ali Ahmad. I'm also an MAIR first year. And so I was wondering, I took a previous class on just the Arab-Israeli conflict, and my professor was saying at times of the highest nationalistic leaders or most, hard on Palestine leaders, Rabin, for example, those are the times where withdrawal and change is happening. And so I was wondering, now we kind of see similar sentiments with Netanyahu, and I guess I would love your analysis of, do you think that trend will continue, or is this going to be the end of that pattern of when change happens? Thank you.
Rob. Thank you very much. Two excellent questions. So just to go back to Georgie to start, do I see kind of a chance to shift perceptions and for this strategy to change? No, in fact, the exact opposite. As I mentioned there, I see Israel basically repeating its past mistakes and doing the same thing over and over again in Gaza. You have this kind of claim now that we need this buffer zone. We need to establish a 1 kilometer buffer zone within the Gaza Strip to stop October the 7th happening again. But this very conveniently forgets that Israel had a buffer zone in the Gaza Strip before October the 7th. It had a strip of territory that it basically said, if you come in this territory, this is a live fire zone, your life will be in danger. It had that. It had overall security control of the Gaza Strip. It controlled all of Gaza's airspace, all of Gaza's access by sea. Israeli policy determined when Palestinian fishermen could fish, for example. It was very, very difficult to leave the Gaza Strip, shall we say. So I don't think that Israel is trying to reinvent the wheel here. They're basically trying to make the case for the same old policies, but it's kind of casually and conveniently forgetting that these were the same policies that Israel had in place on the morning of October the 7th. They didn't work then, and I don't think they're going to work here. So in terms of this strategy, do they see this as not a successful strategy? They could do, but I think Benjamin Netanyahu is basically dependent on this ambiguity to survive. So he's Israel's longest running prime minister. He's in a coalition that is dependent on hard right parties for his survival. He's burned his bridges with just about anyone else. So he basically has to have very, very hardline territorial policies in order for his government to survive. And when he's not hardline, he has to be as ambiguous as possible. So it's less in terms of rational actor model strategic thinking, more in terms of Netanyahu doing all he can to stay in power. In Nassim's question, now, I really don't buy this. You hear this a lot, right? The Likud, in fact, the right-wing conservative party in Israel, say only the Likud can make peace. Why? Because we're the only party with, that are credible enough. We're not like all these softies on the Israeli left. We are, hardline, devoted to the land of Israel. Only us can make peace. You saw that with Menachem Begin, Israel's prime minister, who gave up the Sinai for example. This is the guy who said, my right hand will fall off before I give up a Sinai settlement, then gave up every single Sinai settlement. However, as I argue in my book, I think this is actually Israel's right time trying to take credit for something that they didn't do. Actually, if you look at Israel's withdrawals from the Sinai, for example, this was a very long and gradual process. Literally speaking, Israel left different parts of the Sinai at different times. Its first voluntary withdrawal from the Sinai was in 1974. Its last voluntary withdrawal from the Sinai was in 1982. So it was a very, very long process. Begin, when he comes to power in 77, inherits this process. And if you actually look at what happened at the Camp David negotiations between the Americans, the Egyptians, and the Israelis, Begin tried to do everything in his power to squirm out of actually having to give up the entire Sinai. In fact, the only way that he got away with it was, again, he agreed to it, was this kind of territorial withdrawal as territorial entrenchment. The Egyptians at the time said, we need you to leave the Sinai and most of the West Bank and all of the Gaza Strip. Begin said no, and they said, okay, we need you to leave the Sinai and the Gaza Strip. And he said, there is no way I'm letting the Egyptians anywhere near the Gaza Strip. And then when he left the Sinai, he used that to annex the Golan Heights and increase settlement in the West Bank and the Gaza Strip. And by the way, this is ironic today because the Israelis are begging the Egyptians to take control of the Gaza Strip, and the Egyptians will not touch that territory with a barge pole, right? So this is a huge missed opportunity for Israel, thanks to this hardline leader, Menachem Begin.
Please. Other than at the back.
Hi, my name is Benny, and I'm also a first year MAIR. So
Benny.
Benny, yes. My question is, we talked a lot about the Israeli government and what they do. How does public opinion of the Israeli people factor into this? I don't know if you studied this, and how does that kind of change and shift Israel's foreign policy, especially when it comes to its interactions with Palestine specifically and with other Arab nations in the region? Thank you.
Thanks, Benny. Over here.
Hi, my name is Claire D'Alessio, and I'm a second year MAIA student here. You mentioned that part of the reason that violence is a necessary condition for withdrawal is that it makes the Israelis question the status quo. So I'm wondering, it seems to me that it's really unlikely that the current really brutal attack on Gaza is not going to birth new violence and further hatred and fear and all of this that's going to probably be directed against Israel in the future. Does Israel kind of see that as it makes its calculations in Gaza? Does it see that as a risk going into the future? You mentioned Hezbollah's development in Lebanon. Does it see any similarities there when it's moving forward with this war?
Okay, another two great set of questions. So I will again start with Benny. So the role of public opinion, look, it is crucial in Israel. And again, that's one of the reasons why Menachem Begin, for example, coming back to Nassim's question, why Menachem Begin had to agree to give up the Sinai, just because the Israeli public opinion was so overwhelming. But again, weaving in all the questions, this comes back to Claire's point as well about violence. So before, in late 1972, there was an opinion poll where Israelis were asked, do you want the Sinai or Sharm el-Sheikh, specifically a small part of the Sinai, or peace with Egypt? 90% said, we'd rather have Sharm el-Sheikh, thanks. And then after the Yom Kippur War of October 1973, where Egypt and Syria launched a surprise attack, Egypt's objective there to regain the Sinai Peninsula, the same question is asked a month after the fighting stops. Around the same percentage, 90% of the Israelis say, we'd rather have peace with Egypt than Sharm el-Sheikh, we've changed our minds. So it shows you the transformative role of violence there and the role of public opinion too. In terms of the creation of future violence, Claire's point there, no, basically, because many Israelis, particularly those on the right, think that these people hate Israel already. If you look at, and they often like to draw on historical analogies to demonstrate that. If you look at speeches by Benjamin Netanyahu, for example, Yoav Gallant, then if you look at how they describe Hamas, the same words come up over and over again, the Nazi Hamas. And it's the same thing with Begin Israel's previous prime minister, when he was describing the Palestinian Authority or the Palestinian Liberation Organization, it was always the Nazi PO, the PA, sorry. So this is, this is why they don't think, oh, making violence this kind of violent, what we're doing at the moment will turn people against us, because basically they'll just say they already hate us anyway. You saw what happened on October the 7th. And as a result, I think that's why it kind of justified in Israelis' minds that mentality of, no matter what we do, this is how we get treated. October the 7th happens. Therefore, I think that's why you see Israel operating tactically and operationally the way it does. I mean, I can tell you that Israeli military operations are always going to be controversial, right? They're always going to have their critics. But the operating principles that Israel is implementing in the Gaza Strip are significantly more gloves off than we've ever seen Israel do, from my long history of studying Israel's territorial political conflicts with its neighbors. You're more or less seeing what I would call a doctrine of vengeance at the moment. This kind of idea of, we need to basically teach these guys a lesson. We need to get our own back. And I guess that's manifested in this kind of weird phenomenon that you're seeing in 2024, in warfare in 2024, of soldiers committing war crimes or looting, for example. And that happens in every war, but the difference is they get uploaded to TikToks on their own TikToks, okay? No one is taking action against these people. They are able to pull it off. And that doesn't show, just show a lack of discipline at the infantry level. It shows that at the command level, something is happening here that we've never seen in Israel's conflicts in previous years.
Hands going up everywhere. Over there,
I
please,
think
first.
stoked up a wasp's nest.
Hi, thank you. My name is Sophia, and I'm a second-year master's student. My question builds off a bit of what Benny said about the perceptions of the Israeli population. Claire is speaking about the perceptions of Palestinians in Gaza. I'm kind of curious to hear what you think about perceptions of outsiders, foreigners, populations in other countries. Right now, we're seeing encampments at college campuses around the US and now starting in Europe as well. How do you think this will impact the future of Israel's occupations, et cetera? Do you think that they are losing control of the narrative that has been promoted? And if so, what do you think the impacts of that may or may not be? Thank you.
Thank you. You've stolen my question for me over here.
Good evening. My name is Lydia, and I'm also a student in the International Affairs program. Actually, my question thinks very well, I think, with Sophia's one. So you talked about the importance of international bargain, and my question would be, how optimistic are you regarding an international bargain concerning the current situation in Gaza, but also the further evolution of Israeli occupation, as we already are witnessing a shift not only in the population's mindset, but also at the more international level with the recent positions at the UN. Thank you very much.
Okay, so I will try and crack on, because I saw there's a lot of hands. So on Sophia's point, how the rest of the world sees Israel. Now, I think this is critical, but again, it's kind of coming back again to Claire's point. If you ask a lot of Israelis, all these protests and stuff, does it show that, we are losing the narrative war, for example? Most Israelis will, well, at least a lot of Israelis will tell you, well, they always hated us anyway. So this is basically just a contemporary manifestation of that trend. No matter what Israel does, no matter how humane we are, we're always going to get all this flack from the international community. And this is kind of like a justification argument as well, because then it's not very far away, in terms of causal, in terms of logic, you get to the next step of, well, if it doesn't matter because they're going to hate us anyway, we can do whatever we want, because, we may as well take the gloves off, because we're going to get the book thrown at us anyway, even if we are behaving as we see ourselves the most moral army in the world. So that's kind of one of the key things there. In terms of this public opinion, yeah, I think this is a really transformative event here. So I've been on campuses for a long time in Europe, in the UK, I've traveled, been on campuses in the US. And normally whenever things kick off in the Middle East, it's always European campuses that are kind of the center of protest and kind of criticism of Israel's policies. And the US is actually pretty quiet. this conflict is a complete game changer. You know, the US is kind of the new epicenter of all of these protests. Actually, for example, my own university at Durham, there's basically nothing happening. Though again, it also shows you how you know, Israelis look at all the bad news. Whenever I talk to contacts in Israel, they always tell me, you must be having a really terrible time being an academic in the UK. You know, you must be getting, you know, flack thrown at you left, right. And I said, no, actually, you know, there's been, no one has tried to cancel me yet. No one has occupied my office. You know, I've got, whenever I make a pro-Israel, or not a pro-Israel, a comment that's sort of on Twitter that is trying to make, I guess, kind of understand Israel's perspective or give a context there, I get all these followers with Israel flags, and then when I make a different comment, they all unfollow me, and I get people with Palestine flags following me. So I seem to basically be you know, it's just perception. I think Israelis see all the bad things happening, and they think it's, you know, the whole world is against them. But it is a game changer. This generation is completely different. You know, it's completely different from previous generations that kind of saw Israel as the little guys fighting this sea of, you know, inbuilt Arab opposition to Israel's existence. Because of Israel's change in 1967, its shift from being a revisionist power to a status quo power after it took all of this territory, younger generations see Israel as being an oppressor, basically keeping hold of all this territory and ruling over Palestinians. So it's an Israel-Palestinian conflict rather than a broader Israel-Arab conflict. And I think that's very, very bad news for Israel's image and for Israel's PR. And Lydia's point, the international role in Gaza, there are ways out of this. And the international role in Gaza is one of the key ways. Look, we're hearing, it's not been made official, the Gulf Arab states, the Saudis, the UAE, for example, have said we will take the role, the lead role in Gaza's reconstruction. We will not just finance it, we will send police, we will send bureaucrats, we will basically take the Palestinian Authority in the West Bank, transplant them into Gaza. We know they're not a credible actor, we know they're too weak, we will basically back them up as a more credible force, since we are also Arabs and Muslims, and we will basically grow that into a state, allowing Israel to pull back. But the problem here again is Israel's internal coalition dynamics. That is just something that Israel's government will never even consider at the moment, because it is a pathway to a Palestinian state. And there are people within Israel's government that consider a Palestinian state as a far significant existential threat to Israel's existence, or their vision of Israel, than anything Hamas has ever done, including on October the 7th. And that's why we're still in this logjam today.
Please, questions? Over here, and then behind, I can't see the face of the person behind. Okay.
Hi, my name is Fabian, and I study European politics with a focus on security. And my question is a bit related to what you told us earlier about strategic depth. So over its history, Israel fought multiple wars, multiple conventional wars, and they always had to retaliate kind of decisively and kind of quick against land invasions whatsoever. I wonder to what extent did this reaction transfer into Israeli military doctrine, and is maybe responsible for how Israel reacts to, for example, the attacks from the Gaza Strip in October, and whether this sometimes leads to hastily and maybe wrong decisions within the Israeli military?
Hi, my name is Fo. I am a first-year MAIR student. And my question goes back to kind of your 6 points that you touched on that have to be present for a withdrawal. One, my question is, do all 6 of those points have to be present, or is it just like a mix? It could be 3, 2, 4, etc. And depending on your answer to that first part, in this modern day case today, what point is most influential in its absence in influencing a withdrawal for today, if it's absent or?
That's a really fascinating question. Was it Fo?
Yeah.
Yes. Well, first of all, thank you for asking me like a methodology style question. That's a bit outside the box these days. So do all 6 have to be present? Yes, I'd argue all 6 has to be present. This is one of the issues, for example, why Israel is still in the West Bank, because there has been, for example, international pressure, there has been enemy violence, but there hasn't been that domestic consensus that backs an entire withdrawal from the West Bank, for example. One of the key reasons why Israel remains in that territory today. So and again, I caution against reductionist analyses. I caution against saying all that we need to do is use violence against the Israelis, and then they'll leave the West Bank, for example. That's what happened in the Second Intifada. The Palestinians basically saw the Palestinian Authority, or the Fatah, sorry, the more armed groups affiliated to Fatah, saw what happened in Lebanon. They saw Israel leaving Lebanon in 2000, and they thought, well, you know what, Hezbollah didn't negotiate with Israel. They just used violence and got Israel out of Lebanon. A very reductionist analysis of that withdrawal, but then they applied it to the West Bank. Disaster followed for the Palestinian people, because you get then Israel throwing the gloves off in the Second Intifada, reoccupying Palestinian cities, and actually basically defeating the Palestinians through a counterinsurgency campaign. First Intifada was all about civil disturbances, strikes, and that kind of thing. And the Israeli military didn't know how to deal with them. They responded, as most militaries don't know how to deal with them, respond with brute force, and that completely alienated the international community. The Second Intifada is completely different, because you see more of a kind of insurgency campaign, suicide bombings, shooting attacks against Israel, which is a far more powerful adversary. Once Israel takes the gloves off, then it changes the dynamic in Israel's favor. And one of the reasons why Israel remains in the West Bank today, because they basically said, look, we won, so why do we need to leave? So I caution against this reductionist analysis. In terms of the things that are missing today, well, I'd say you do have international pressure, you do have enemy violence. The problem is that it hasn't, I guess the new status quo hasn't settled yet. We need to get to a ceasefire before we see which of these points are present or absent. So, for example, enemy violence, if you talk to Israelis during the Yom Kippur War, they probably wouldn't have said to you, yes, we need to give up Sinai. But it was only afterwards, once the dust settles and people start, thinking and looking at what happened and analyzing, when we're in a post-war scenario, then we can start looking at what those points are missing or absent. But we're just not there yet, unfortunately. Fabian's point, I mean, you're preaching to the choir here. This is absolutely fascinating. There is a PhD waiting to be written on how Israel's conquest of territories in the Six-Day War completely changed the IDF's military doctrine. As you say, before the Six-Day War, the military doctrine of the IDF was always take the war to the enemy's territory, strike fast, strike hard, strike beyond Israel. As soon as Israel wins all those territories, it changes to hold the territories we've got, basically police those territories, administer those territories, and defend them from foreign attack. And that was what led to the Yom Kippur War. Israel built a load of forts along the border with Egypt. Those forts fell very, very quickly. Same thing on October the 7th, as you alluded to there. Israel built a defensive system along the Gaza border, felt it could just basically hold that. That was proven to be completely false, unfortunately. So, yeah, I would, to be honest, I would love to know more about this topic. It is absolutely fascinating. So thank you for bringing it up.
Yeah, Tito. Sumaya.
My name is Sumaya. So based on what you just mentioned, that violence wouldn't be enough. First, I'll give another, not quite analogous, but similar example in terms of violence as resistance for liberation purposes. If we're looking at like Haiti and France, different dynamic still. Haitian Revolution used violence. US colony against the British Empire used violence, succeeded. So in those cases, it took violent resistance, but also that violent resistance based on the doctrine of Frantz Fanon brought the colonizer or the oppressor to the negotiating table to even provide their liberation. But based on what you're saying, because this is a very special case here, it seems like you would need the international support component. What's very ironic to me here in terms of Western hypocrisy is if you can't have Western justified violent resistance for liberation, and that coupled with international support, then it almost seems like, based on today in the past 75 years, like you're not going to get any type of Israeli withdrawal, because until the Western countries decide that Palestinian resistance is justified just as much as Ukrainian resistance against Russia and any other European resistance against a colonizer or oppressor or a settler colonial state, until that's real and in our reality, then it seems like the violence will continue, the genocide will continue. And the other hypocritical factor of this is that I liked your point about Israel creating its own insecurity. I would analyze this as Israel being the perfect example of how not to build security. Because again, based on Fanon's doctrine, the more that an oppressor or occupier exerts violence, the more collective trauma it instills physically and psychologically in the occupied peoples, and the more it requires for that not only to be released to regain those people's autonomy, but for them to physically force off this occupier from occupying from their land. So do you see any hope for the international community, as we call it, to even humanize the Palestinians enough, separate from Hamas and their own distinctions of other groups, to even bring something like this as Palestinian liberation or deoccupation forward? Because we have to be real. We can't just look at this from fancy suits in a classroom perspective, because these are real lives. And, you know, this is not going to be fully taken care of at a negotiating table if people are not humanized. So I would like to know your thoughts on that.
Okay, Peter.
Peter Cordell, I'm an economist here. So just one quick question. So in your framework to analyze what are how countries withdraw from, how occupier withdraw, the things I've seen missing is why they occupied. So the question is that, is there anything on the reason, on the way in which a country occupy a particular territory that tells us something about the way in which it can be withdrawn?
Yep, I'll go ahead. Yeah. Thank you, Tito. That was whenever economists ask questions, I'm always terrified because I'm not a numbers guy, right? I know I'm in a US policy institution, so I've got to be careful here. But that was a question that I could understand and answer. So thank you for that. In terms of why occupy, I think that is a critical factor in determining when an occupation ends. But a lot of the time it's not so clear cut. So there was one of the few guys who's written on occupation is a professor called David Edelstein over at Georgetown, and he wrote a book on occupations. And his question was, why do military occupations succeed or fail? And he came up with a nice data set of occupations: occupation, fail, succeed. That suggests that you can easily identify what the goals of each occupation were. Right. And this is kind of the problem here. And I think if you look at Israel's occupation, not just Israel's occupations, also the US's occupations of Haiti and the Dominican Republic, very, very rarely does an occupier go in and say, right, this is our very simple, achievable goal that we all agree on. More often than not, you know, people in the same cabinet have different justifications for going in. In the US occupations of Haiti and the Dominican Republic, you had people arguing we were going in there to get rid of the German influence on the island. You had people going in there saying that we were going to bring civilization to these islands. You had people talking about business interests, people talking about security goals. So it's very, very difficult to identify why occupy. I think it does play a role when it's less opaque. It often tends to involve a quicker and easier withdrawal, but more often than not, I think it's completely contested and more or less impossible to identify, you know, why the occupier actually went in, simply because there's never any consensus. On Samaya's point, there's a lot to unpack there, right? In terms of resistance, so first we use the Haitian Revolution, the US War of Independence. I often caution against using those kind of historical examples, just because the way people behave back then, the way states behave back then is completely different to today, right? We're talking about colonies, for example, in those cases. We're talking about, you know, basically not occupiers, basically states saying we're here forever because it's our right to take and absorb more territory because there's not many states over in the world, so it's completely fine to do that. Nowadays, it's a completely different kettle of fish. And yes, you know, warfare has become more destructive, but also the amount of force you are allowed to unleash is you are more constrained by international law and international norms, for example. So I think it's hard to apply those. You know, you get Israelis who will always say to you, if only we'd been founded 100 years ago, we'd been able to do population transfers and annexations and all that kind of thing, and we'd get to a solution straight away. I don't agree with that take, but it does show you that a lot of these post-colonial states, including Israel and these post-colonial states, states formed after empires dissolved, don't have that freedom that their colonial masters might have had once, to basically just decide where their territory, where their borders will lie, and to start wars willy-nilly. In terms of violence and violent resistance, look, if I was an advisor to the Palestinian national movement, I'd say the best way forward is to practice mass non-violent resistance or civil disobedience. This was what happened in the first Intifada of 1987 to 1993. And the Palestinians, I think, came closer to a state during that time than they've ever come before, because basically they they managed to make Israel alienate world opinion by responding to protests and strikes with brutal violence. You know, when it's actually violence on violence, it's kind of easier for Israel to justify its violent response, because occupiers always respond to enemy violence with violence of their own. But if you have scenes like what happened on October the 7th, Israeli governments can then use that to say, you know, what we're doing is justified because October the 7th. This doctrine of vengeance is justified because of how they treated us, for example. So the only problem with that is Israel shuts down all non-violent resistance, and it's much easier to do so when that resistance is non-violent. And this, you know, touches on the status quo. What we had on October the 7th, on the morning of October the 7th, was Israel basically thought that they had managed to solidify a status quo permanently, because they had the Palestinian Authority, who is the international community's chosen bargaining partner, you know, like the quote unquote good guys in Palestine terms, because they're in favor of a two-state solution. They're secular, you know, they're relatively pro-US, or in the US camp, for example. They were seen as too weak and too inefficient to be trusted with a state. Hamas was seen as able to have a state by force of arms, but were too illegitimate to be included in the negotiating process. So this was part of Netanyahu's strategy for freezing the status quo indefinitely, having Hamas doing the administering and the governing in the Gaza Strip, but he thought being too weak or too deterred from being able to pick a fight with Israel, but too illegitimate to negotiate with. The Palestinian Authority doing all the governing in the West Bank, whilst being too weak or too corrupt to have negotiations with. So this was a status quo that Israel created. Though you will hear many times, many members of the Israeli Foreign Ministry, for example, say to you, "Oh, if only the Palestinian Authority was stronger, we could negotiate with them." But it's Israel who's holding the cards here, you know, and they really thought they had it. They really thought they had the status quo frozen indefinitely. On October the 7th, in its brutality and its inhumane acts and its war, in the war crimes that were committed there, they changed that. So we're still in a case where the deck's being reshuffled.
Last two questions, please. Right at the back in the white shirt or jumper or whatever it is.
Hi, my name is William. I'm a first-year MAIA student. And my question is, I'm curious what you have to say on the discourse surrounding why Israel looms so large in the imagination of American politics and European politics versus other conflicts that are happening around the world. I think that there are obvious changes, but I know that discourse is very contested, especially in Israel, where people see it as, or some people at least see it as like a manifestation of anti-Semitism in the West. So yeah, that was my question. Thank you.
Okay, one more. No? Hey, one more over here. Matthew.
My initial question was answered with the international sort of consortium one. I'm more curious, I think, as to the US role, particularly here, and the comparisons that you might draw with apartheid South Africa and the ending of that. So when South Africa became rightfully so a pariah state, the US was the last one kind of holding the cards and propping it up. Once the US dropped that, so did the apartheid regime also fell apart. In this scenario, Israel is also becoming a pariah state, also rightfully so, given its conduct in Gaza and the West Bank. So I'm curious, there's a lot of countries still backing Israel, but we see a clear shift in European policy. With what's going on in the US, I'm curious how you see a potential US policy shift and also a potential US sort of led UN consortium for reconstruction in Gaza, because it's very unlikely that Israel will let the Arab states aid with that reconstruction. As you mentioned, that would have to be the only authority that Israel actually listens to, the US, or, I mean, doesn't listen to the UN, but, you know, that's why I mentioned a US-led UN consortium. So yeah, the difference is between South Africa and Palestine today, and also the potential for a consortium in Gaza.
So I actually think that Israel listens to the Arab states like Saudi Arabia and the UAE more than it listens to the UN. Okay, so if anyone's going to be rebuilding Gaza, I think Israel would much prefer it with those states than the UN. Israelis across the political spectrum hate the UN. They basically see it, coming back to William's question, as kind of inherently anti-Semitic, anti-Israel institution with whom they can never ever do business. Actually, ironically, they don't see the same about those Arab states like the UAE, for example. You often hear people say, well, you know, they're paying lip service to the cause, but actually secretly they're on our side. And there kind of is some truth in that, simply because it's kind of like a regional conflict, right? You have these kind of status quo powers like Israel and the Gulf Arab states, and then you have the revisionist axis led primarily by Iran. And it's kind of like a regional clash between these two different visions for the region and indeed for the world order. So I'd argue that there's very little chance of the UN getting involved. The US, I think, is not going to get involved in on the ground reconstruction in terms of a physical presence, simply for domestic US reasons. Okay, I think we're very unlikely to see boots on the ground, large scale US boots on the ground anywhere in the next few years, simply because, you know, the US had this post 9/11 grand strategy of interventionism, of basically throwing itself around there. It didn't work very well for it. It's incredibly unpopular, both with Biden and with Trump, by the way, and with their respective parties. So I think if Israel wants Gaza to be rebuilt, either it will have to do the rebuilding, the policing, the humanitarian aid, and the everyday governance itself, which I don't think it will ever do, or someone else will have to do it, you know. And this is why Netanyahu is kind of playing all sorts of verbal gymnastics at the moment, saying we want Palestinians to do it, but not the Palestinian Authority, but not Palestinians. We want local Gazans who are, notables, but not affiliated to Hamas. That's not even possible. Okay, Hamas has been in power since 2007. If you're a notable in Gaza, you've had some working relationship with Hamas. Otherwise, you wouldn't be a notable anymore. So I think they know it will be the Arab states. I just don't think it's politically tenable for Netanyahu to say that at the moment. He's trying to do his usual Netanyahu thing of deferring the issue for as long as possible in the hope that a solution will then present itself. In the question, the apartheid question, I don't want to dodge this one, but I'll answer it as quickly as possible. I think the key difference here is that Israel's regime type is different where you look, okay? I would argue that inside Israel, you have a system founded on democracy. Is it institutionally racist? Yes. Is it a very, very racist and discriminatory society? Yes. But at the same time, you know, constitutionally speaking, for example, Palestinian citizens of Israel do have a significant number of rights. They have significantly more rights than the Palestinians in the West Bank and the Gaza Strip, who are under military rule and basically don't have, and as a result are governed by an army. They're not governed by a political system in that extent. So I'd argue that if there is apartheid, it's clearly manifesting in the West Bank rather than necessarily in Israel yet, though it is seeping through. There's this long-term Israeli left slogan, the occupation corrupts. And I think you do see that with the rise of the far right, the rise of racist xenophobic politics, for example. It's always been there, but I think now it's more out in the open than ever before. So in the case of South Africa, that was state collapse. That was the entire state basically being founded upon this premise of apartheid. In Israel, it's more complicated. Is the dodge I would give to that question. In terms of the question of why is Israel looming so large, I really don't know, to be honest with you. And I find it hard to answer because I'm someone who has devoted about 15 years of my life, rightly or wrongly, to studying the Israel-Palestine conflict and the Israel-Arab conflict rather than other conflicts worldwide. Why is it? Is it because I am pro-Israel? I don't think so. Is it because I'm anti-Semitic? I certainly hope not. So why is this? I think it's a mixture of factors. I think, first of all, there's, this European feeling that, we played a role in this because of the Holocaust, for example. There's also this feeling that Israel is, kind of a European import state, for example, on the other side of the spectrum. There's all sorts of attempts to apply some of the dynamics and language, like from the Black Lives Matter campaign to Israel, for example, saying that, for example, Zionism is white supremacy. I'm a big critic of Zionism and the ideology upon which Israel founded, but I don't think that it's white supremacy, for example. But you do see this attempt to kind of export everything that you believe in and pin it onto a mast and to kind of pick a team either way. in the Arab-Israel conflict. You know, for me, it's kind of like watching a football game. People say you're either these guys or these guys. And I think that is the way to dehumanize. Okay, that is when I switch on Israeli TV, do I see anything about Palestinian victims or Palestinian claim to statehood? Nothing. Okay, when I look at Twitter discourse by people who are pushing the Palestinian cause, I often see people saying October the 7th didn't happen, or Israel killed all those people, or it's lying about what happened. Again, it's the same rhetoric of dehumanization. So if I can just end on one point, is that I think we need to get out of this football game mentality. This is real lives. These are real people's lives. And at the end of the day, there are very, very rarely straight up good guys and straight up bad guys. On both sides, there are good people doing bad things and there are bad people doing bad things. And we need to be critical of narratives on both sides if we're going to get any way towards progress in this long, divisive conflict that shows no signs of ending anytime soon.
I think we can only thank Rob very much indeed for giving such a dispassionate and interesting account.
Slightly passionate. Sorry.
Well, I'm passionate too. Yeah, he only got one thing wrong. Nothing's ever happened at Durham University, not just right now. But I would add to this though, just one other thing. It also, I think, shows the importance of looking at events through a theoretical lens. You know, we're in Carl Schmitt territory. Just very much so. Thank you very much.
Oh, thank you very much. I hope that was spec.